They say the throne grants life, but I arrived choking on mine. My first memory, a mouthful of ash that scraped like ground glass across my teeth and sat behind my tongue as if it had paid rent to stay there. The air itself a trespass in my lungs that burned and bit instead of kissing breath into me. The sky a ceiling the color of oxidized iron bruised by storms that carried only grit and grief. Never rain, never mercy. Only that chemical heat that peeled the eyes raw and left the world filmed in rust and sorrow. And high above our stilts, the winds came hard-edged and ribboned with toxins, as if the planet had learned to wet its own weather on our bones. To sharpen each gust into a small knife we had to swallow to prove we belonged. Where no one should our settlement had a name, but we used numbers because pride costs oxygen. We called it Stiltabkeris 9 because 12 had existed and 3 remained. The rest sunk into acid loam with the quiet patience of a mouth closing over its meal. The metal legs that held us above the fuming crust trembled to a rhythm older than prayer. The deck plate sweated with corrosion, and the ground below smoked like the back of a sleeping beast that hated to dream. And there were nights the vents exhaled a breath so sour we rapped, babies in rebreather cloaks stitched from 100 storms, and listened to the filtration engines groan like old animals whose suffering became a hymn. And still we kept working, because work kept lungs moving, and moving lungs were counted as devotion, and devotion meant the Emperor might notice us if only to let us endure another dawn we had not. And my mother pressed her cracked lips to my brow through the hood of her mask and whispered the catechism we all inherited like a sickness. Not tender words, but an iron litany shaped to fit a throat used to bleeding. By breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve. And I learned those syllables before numbers, before the taste of clean water, before any picture of a blue sky I was told once existed. And the elders said there had been seas and fields and winds that carried sense other than metal and rot. But to us such talk was a rumor of weakness, a fable told to make children waste air, because our weather had edges, and our soil spat fire, and our nights crawled with fumes that glimmered like ghosts at the hatches. And if you cried, someone would put a hand over your mouth, not unkindly, only to save the breath that the cry would spend for nothing. When the air recyclers failed, we learned the sacrament of silence, how to stand in rooms gone thin and grey, while faces blackened at the edges like paper held too close to a coil, how to listen to the hush of suffocation walking low along the floors, as if it had ankles and a destination. And the elders said not to scream, because screaming is a tax you pay to fear, and we could not afford taxes that did not buy time. And when dawn came late or not at all, we stacked the bodies on scrap pyres and watched the smoke tatter upward into the same poison that had made those bodies light enough to lift. And we said the prayer without tears, because grief is loud, and loud means open valves, and open valves mean death, and the only currency here was quiet. The only wealth a mask that didn't leak, and a spine that could stand while the wind measured your secrets. I was 6 when I learned the sky could kill the ground and call it mercy, sent with other children up the outer gantries to scrape clogstone from the vents, while clouds crouched low and red, like inflamed wounds stitched with lightning. And when the storm broke, the first gust filled my eyes with grit, and the second peeled a vent panel away with a sound like bones taught to sing. And far below, the earth answered with a slow-lidded blaze, a vertical wound breathing fire. And for a heartbeat, I thought the planet had woken in a bad mood and found my name written under the word intruder. And I clutched the railing and spat black into the drain, and felt the small knives of dust teach my lips to bleed, as if to mark me for attendance. And when it passed, the silence was worse, because it felt like something listening through its teeth to decide if I had learned my lesson. News of Habkeris 10's collapse moved through the lower decks with the economy of a ledger. Not grief, just numbers. A stilt dragged down, a kilometer east, many gone, perhaps all. And the elders nodded the way old metal nods to a welder. Functional, resigned, grateful in that hard arithmetic that counts survival as theft from a hungrier mouth. And that night, my mother stared into the heater's dull glow and said, "The ground takes the faithful eventually." I misunderstood and thought faithful meant the ones who prayed hardest until the years taught me faithful was only those who kept breathing longest. And we walked the gantries with our chins tucked against the spice of corrosion, learning how to feel tremors through boot soles, and how to measure a future by the color of rain that never touched us. And when the cable lifts went down into the fog, we watched with the clean stares of people who had no charity left to spend on outcomes they could not alter. I was 8 when I saw a man unravel, a scavenger who came back dragging metal brighter than our own, day and grinning through a hymn until the grin went glassy and black vapor stitched. From a torn seal began to leak, from his suit like a secret he could not stop telling, and he went to his knees with a fish's mouth, and no one touched him because kindness is conductive, and we do not die twice for the same lesson. And the floor drank the sound of his thrashing, while the stench of cooked parchment grew a new vocabulary inside my nose that never left. And when he stopped, an elder cut the aquila in the air above the husk and said his breath returns to him, and all I could think was that the air here returns to itself, a selfish sea that keeps what falls into it. And that night the ducks sighed like exhausted throats, while I learned how to watch without moving, how to let a horror finish its sentence before my body replied. The storms came like arguments the planet enjoyed too much, their voices a grind of teeth on bone. And when the alarms went up, we shut the hatches and spoke to the filters with our hands, praying by tightening seals and kicking bulky fans until their cough lengthened into a breath again. And once the lower gates failed, and the gas slipped along the corridor like an idea we didn't consent to think, lights pulsing a wounded red while people coughed and clawed, and the air went syrup thick. And I pressed my mask to my mother's shawl and counted between her ribs because numbers, not faith, kept panic from chewing through me. 12, 13, 14, and the hiss passed and we lived and a dozen didn't. And we burned them without names because names snag on grief, and grief sheds heat we could use for better work. And the smoke joined the old smoke that made the world into a single long exhalation. We kept failing to finish. 10 years asked for a proof of lungs, so they sent us to the surface with rebreathers that had already kept other faces alive, and told us to survive, until a dawn that looked like rot, to stand in air that tasted of coins and old blood, and the memory of language lost to coughing, and the elders watched from the gantries with their hands folded like closed hinges. And the night had those pale flickers in the fog that sometimes walked like beasts and sometimes like prayers that refused to end. And I stood beside the ribs of a machine, older than any scripture we owned, and said nothing until the wheeze of my filter became the only voice that mattered. And in the last hour I took off the mask once and breathed raw. Once, and it felt like swallowing a handful of heated wire. And I did not drop. And when they hauled us in at dawn, the survivors had new eyes the color of tempered metal, and the others were accounted as offerings we did not waste on lament. Work taught us to fit our bodies into gaps machines resented, to crawl the ducts where fungus wept and fans roared like domesticated storms, to scavenge the graveyard plains where the bones of void-era engines tilted like the skeletons of unfriendly saints. And we moved in knotted groups with masks too big and knives too small while the ground glittered with toxins, and the horizon never learned to soften. And the things that lived out there were not animals, so much as the planet's grammar given muscle and teeth, slick pale shapes with glassy eyes and too many elbows that ate gas and corpse both. And the first time one came for us, it rose from the breathless soil around a ration crate and folded a boy named Jan into itself with a crunch that rearranged my understanding of bone. And we ran and were punished because running spends order, and order is oxygen with stripes. And the next day we found what could be buried. A hand, a strip of cloth, a rebreather dented into a mask of regret, and I put them in the dust and left the space above them blank. The overseer who taught us the litany of pain was called Vak, because names with vowels were a luxury, and he spoke through a wounded filter that made each word sound welded. Pain is proof you are still being counted, he said, and we repeated it until our tongues learned obedience as a shape. And his shock rod kissed anyone who hesitated, not with malice but with maintenance. And we learned to crawl before we learned to walk because the ducks did not forgive knees that argued. And when filters stalled, the fumes filled the crawls with an invisible tide, and hands that paused became story heat for other people's nights. And the elders said that flesh in the ducts purifies air, and I believed it long enough to survive, which is the only measure that mattered here, where the school was a manufactorum, carcass opened by a storm, and the floor a lattice that glowed faintly from the chemical sea below, and every lesson ended with the same exam. Make your breath count less than your usefulness. On nights when storms welded the doors shut, we slept in postures made by fear and rust, and counted the slow fall of dust from the rafters, while something heavy and patient tested the stilts. And now and then, we were permitted to trade a minute of water with a girl whose hair had gone white the way metal goes when heat forgets it. And her name was Iska, and she smiled like a crack in paint, not joy and accommodation. And a week later, she went out for scrap and never taught the hatches her footfall again. And the elders said the ground took her back like a tide that remembered, and I chose to believe she walked beyond our map until even the poison bowed, and that belief lasted until a quake tore our outer platforms loose, and I was ordered down into a heat that made boots sing, and the wreckage was strung with people half melted to iron in knee, gestures still trying to be human, and the salvage was sacred and the bodies were weight, and I felt nothing larger than a clean respect for efficiency, because reverence is learned, and ours was for ruin well organized. We called death a neighbor, not an event, a presence you hear in vents and in the thin place where fog presses cheek to hatch. And I kept a tally on my palm of the days that did not kill us, until the tally became a scar that lied about what it meant, and soon the tremors came often enough to give the stilts a permanent shiver, and fear learned to walk in our ankles and live in our tools. And some said the planet wanted us gone like a skin wants the splinter out, and others said the God Emperor put us here to prove something to him that he had no time to grade. And when my mother told me to find mercy inside the poison, I laughed dry, because laughter wastes and mercy is a word that can't hold weight here. And the next morning her filter failed in her sleep, and I found her still and quiet behind the mask, with a serenity that made me hate and love her in the same breath I could not spare. And I sat and breathed the same bad air beside her, until none of it felt like theft anymore, and then we burned her, and the smoke made claim to her last service. After that I stopped asking the air to be kind, because it had already taken its tithe and found me still present, and I walked the gantries alone, watching the rusted horizons brood under red weather, and the bones of older stilts jut from the flats like the ribs of a giant that died slow, and every place the wind touched seemed etched with ghosts that had learned to make their hauntings light. And if I closed my eyes, the taste of ash returned with a lover's punctuality, and I called it memory. And the dream of a blue sky turned into a story I told to test whether I could still lie. And I understood then that endurance is not survival dressed for parade. It is simply the absence of surrender measured in breaths, and breath is only a number you count until something stops you. And we were raised not to live but to be used, until we made burning sound administrative and grief cheap enough to purchase with a glance. By adolescence, the ground learned my name and spoke it through the stilts in small, intimate vibrations like a rumor you feel in your teeth. And the elders said the world was hollow with old tunnels and chambers, where forgotten industries had mined meanings out of rock until meanings mined back. And I did not believe until the tremors strung themselves into a sentence, and metal leaned where it should have stood, and one night a moan rose from below like thunder trying to remember a prayer, and we sealed our doors and pretended to kneel for 3 days, while the sound argued with our bones, and when it faded, we found where Keras 11 had vanished clean into a hole that breathed a slow poisonous mist, like the sigh of a satisfied mouth, and they named it the Maw, because we liked to domesticate terror with labels, and we went to its lip in the dark, because children spend curiosity the way adults spend rations, and we saw shadows moving under the fog like debts, and a boy leaned too far and the chasm exhaled and something took him without a scream, because some hungers go about their work politely. After that the ground stopped waiting for us to visit and sent tendrils up through the cracks, not roots but the idea of roots given gore, pale cords that pulsed faintly as if counting, and when we set them alight, they made a noise soft enough to hurt the ears, and the supports learned to hum with that pitch. And we learned a new title for what we feared, the beasts below, though the name tasted like an excuse for not knowing, and rumors went to work. Some said old mining fauna, some said the planet's immune system, Some said demons drilled into matter, but the Imperium demanded tithe of ore and labor, while the ground rewrote our map. So we kept sending lifts down and brought fewer faces back and called the deficit piety. And one night what climbed was not rumor, but an animal of flesh and chitin and logic that hated our angles, a vertical maw and a hide like oiled bone, and last fire stitched neat lines into fog that did not notice it was being branded. And the stilts snapped like bad sentences. And we ran because reflex beats worship every time. When the fog fell back, half our world was gone, and the rest leaned like a confession. And the overseers howled into a beacon that fed the sky what we could not eat. And the answer never arrived, or arrived as static, and we rebuilt on narrower shoulders, teaching our boots to walk like thieves so the beasts would not feel our weight. And I slept with a blade made from a prayer plate worn thin by hands. And my fear changed shape, no longer a spike in the throat but a sense like smell, a way to map hunger in the earth before it lifted its head. And some nights I watched winged things drift above the fog like Mercury learning grace. And when Keris 9 died at dawn with a series of neat fractures that made the horizon blink, I stood at the edge and looked into the churning glow and thought for the first time that maybe the truest God here was the one that did not speak. The soil that wanted us back inside it, where voices stopped meaning and the fog leapt and spared me as if contempt were a form of charity. And I learned another lesson about what it means to be chosen the way a knife chooses the gap. Between ribs after the collapse I wandered the flats that clink when you walk, and the old stilt stuck out of the ground like accusation, half feral and half machine, body lean as a cable, mask patched with rivets of luck. And I ate what refused to rot and drank what did not hiss at the cup. And the stars above were smudges behind weather that had never read of rain. And I learned again the truth that taste will betray you, because everything tasted like metal, even dreams. And when the sky split with fire not born of storm, and the sound came down with the authority of engines trained by faith, my knees went to the dirt by themselves because habit is a species of prayer. And I watched ships fall through the poison like clean knives, ramps unfold with a surgeon's calm, and figures descend in armor that made them look like answers. Their vox voices the confident grammar of rule, their banners double-headed and bright enough to make me blink, as if my eyes had forgotten that white exists. They recognized me before I could recognize myself, a feral bundle of scars and filtration cloth, lit by flood lamps that made the air taste almost like nothing. And they spoke to me in high cant that sounded like cold water poured over hot metal. And I said, don't shoot with a throat more rust than voice. And they dragged me into a perimeter where the atmosphere ran through machines that disciplined it into goodness. And I coughed at the absence of pain because absence has edges too. And their medici counted the toxins printed in my blood, like a ledger of debts someone else would never pay. And more survivors came sniffing the light like blind animals, gathered in pens of clean mesh and cleaner intentions, fed ration paste whose taste was arithmetic, and some wept until the guards taught them not to. And the counting began because the Imperium is a ledger that counts men into categories of usefulness, and the category called mercy has no budget line. What I miss most from those first years is the honesty of the poison, the way it never pretended to mean anything but harm, the unadorned arithmetic of hunger and weather and metal. And yet my mother's prayer still walks the inside of my mouth when the night goes long. By breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve. And I taste iron when I say it, because every word has a cost, and iron is the coin that bought me. And when the sirens sleep and the barracks creak like old stilts, and I close my eyes, I can feel the ground of Keris 9 tremble under me again, as if it were saying my name through a floor made of reasons. And I understand that I am not finished being property of a place that tried to kill me and failed. And failure binds as tightly as love in a galaxy, where silence from the throne is the loudest sermon we will ever hear. We were told that discipline was mercy, and that mercy was only another word for control. And so we learned to breathe in unison, to let our hearts fall into step with the machine rhythm of the camp, every dawn beginning with the crack of a drill master's voice that carried the chill of command through the frost like a clean wound. And the first thing stripped from us was individuality. The notion that a name could make a man different from the next in line, because names attract memory and memory slows obedience. And the Emperor, we were told, required speed of action, not depth of thought. So our names became numbers written on tags that swung from our collars, and the only music left in the mornings was the clang of boots, the rattle of gear, the chant of litany that tasted of rust, a chorus meant to sand the edges from the mind until nothing inside echoed anymore. They remade our bodies before they remade our faith, shaving us to rawness, running solvents over skin until it burned and gleamed, feeding us paste that numbed taste itself, because hunger and flavor are luxuries of free things, and we were to be useful, not free. And we marched through mud that froze, through gravel that tore our souls open. The sergeants walking behind with shock prods and calm voices, reciting scripture that was mostly logistics. And when one of us stumbled, the rest stepped around him because pity breaks formation, and formation is worship, and the world around the camp was grey and clean, the soil so barren it couldn't even rot. The wind stripped of all scent, and I missed the stench of poison then, missed the familiarity of a world that at least admitted it hated me, because this new air was polite, sanitized, indifferent, the kind of air that erases instead of kills. The lectures came after drills, when bodies trembled and minds were most porous, and the priest-instructor stood beneath the aquila cast in iron, his robes smelling of oil and sanctified smoke, his words a tide of comfort sharpened by threat. Pain, he said, is not suffering, it is correction. And we repeated it until the syllables lost meaning, because repetition polishes sin into doctrine. And when he raised the scourge, he did not call it punishment but purification. And the lashes fell with mathematical precision, 1 for hesitation, 2 for thought, 3 for forgetting to smile at an order. And afterward, we knelt in rows bleeding quietly into the sand. And I remember looking at the drops, soaking into the earth and realizing that even the soil here was more orderly than the blood that fed it. The pattern of crimson absorbed in neat spirals, as if the planet itself had learned bureaucracy. At night, we slept in cots bolted to the floor so that even dreams couldn't shift the alignment of the room, and the walls hummed with power lines that whispered prayers in machine tongue, a lullaby of current and servos turning unseen gears. And sometimes when I woke, the hum would rise into words almost human, the kind that live just beyond translation, a murmur about purpose, about endurance, about the kindness of obedience, and I would lie still pretending not to hear because curiosity is a punishable hunger, and the next morning I would march again, and the frost would crunch beneath the boots of hundreds moving like one instrument, and the breath misting before us looked like the ghost of the same prayer we all repeated without faith. Because faith implies choice, and choice is waste, and waste is treason against the Emperor's design. The camp produced soldiers the way manufacturers produce bolts, stamped, tempered, identical, and the overseers said we were the Emperor's currency minted fresh, and the more perfectly uniform the coin, the higher its value, and those who broke under training were recycled quietly, their numbers erased, their rations redistributed, their absence catalogued not as death, but as administrative adjustment. And soon none of us asked about missing faces, because the ledger replaces empathy faster than time does. And I learned to measure my worth by the weight of the rifle and the precision of my salute. Because both could be inspected, both could be quantified, and everything else inside was a liability. The self and indulgence no longer required by the machinery of devotion. Once a week, they paraded us into the chapel, a steel nave that smelled of lubricant and incense, the walls engraved with oaths so small they resembled scars, and above the altar hung a screen that projected the image of the Emperor's face, golden still, too vast for mercy, and the chaplain's voice was an echo of static wrapped in rhythm. "You are his lungs," he said. "You breathe so he does not have to." And the congregation answered as trained, "By breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve." And I mouthed the words until they felt like rust against my teeth, wondering if endurance still counted when it was chosen for you. If survival means anything when it becomes someone else's evidence of order. And I decided not to ask. Because questions invite air and air invites memory, and memory suffocates faster than poison. The first deployment came as a rumor of thunder that walked on the horizon days before the order did. Transports lined like teeth along the landing pads, engines warming with a growl that set the snow vibrating, and they told us the destination was mild, a world tamed by the Imperium's touch, a place of breathable air and obedient soil. And the words almost sounded like mercy, until I remembered that mercy here was just a quieter form of execution. And when the ramp rose and the hull sealed us in the dark belly of the ship, the recycled oxygen carried the taste of cold metal and antiseptic faith. And as the engine's roar built to something that rattled the bones loose from prayer, I realized that every journey in the Imperium begins the same way, as escape disguised as service, as hope replaced by assignment, as exile written on official parchment. The void crossing lasted long enough for time to forget its manners, and the ship sang its mechanical psalms through the walls, while we hung in our straps like offerings preserved for later use. Eyes closed against the weightless churn that pressed thoughts flat, and the chaplain's voice filled the intercom in measured intervals to remind us that fear is the first symptom of disobedience, that courage is simply the absence of choice, that the Emperor's silence is approval. And I tried to believe it, because belief smooths the hours better than reason does. And when gravity returned, it did so like judgment, hard and final, and we landed in a world painted in colors that felt illegal. Soft greens, yellow light, rivers that moved without acid in them, and men cried at the sight not from joy but confusion, because beauty after horror is its own kind of cruelty. We disembarked in ranks, rifles tight against armor, eyes lowered to the soil that gave beneath our boots, as if uncertain whether to accept the weight, and the air was clean enough to taste absence, a flavor that hurt worse than poison, and we inhaled greedily until our lungs remembered too late that breathing is not always survival. And the officers barked commands with ritual precision, tents unfolding like flowers of steel, banners rising into an obedient sky. And I realized then that the Imperium colonizes even the weather, teaches the wind to stand at attention, the sun to obey the schedule of war. And the sound of construction blended with prayer, hammer, and hymn in perfect synchrony, because nothing in this empire is allowed to exist quietly. It must serve, it must prove, it must repeat itself until usefulness becomes holy. The first engagement came sooner than the sermons predicted, a village of dissidents. They said insurgents, raiders, unregistered lives, and the briefing told us that non-compliance is contagion, that pity breeds infection, that the Emperor's mercy is sterilization, and when we marched through their fields, the crops bent away from us like hair from flame, and the huts were small, wooden, human, too human, and the silence before contact was the kind that breathes against your neck. And when the order to fire came, it was a whisper that bloomed into thunder, and the world turned bright with structured violence, each beam of lasfire a punctuation mark in the Emperor's vocabulary. And afterward, we stood among the smoking shapes of what used to be resistance and listened to the chaplain declare the ground purified. And I thought about purity as absence again, about how emptiness always passes inspection. Afterward, we dug in, trenches carved into soil that welcomed the spade, the first easy earth any of us had ever touched, and we spoiled it quickly, packing it with metal and blood until it learned to behave like home. And at night, when the air cooled and the stars pressed close, I could almost hear the heartbeat of the planet beneath the guns, steady, patient, unimpressed, and I whispered to it sometimes the way a man whispers to a corpse he still respects, "You're too gentle for them," and the ground hummed as if amused, and somewhere in the distance, the chaplain's prayers rose over the static, promising that each breath we took was a step closer to sanctification. And I laughed quietly, because laughter sounds like blasphemy when it's honest. And I was tired of being sanctified. We fought for months on that world. Each skirmish another sermon written in plasma and dust, each order another verse of the same song. And I began to see the pattern beneath it all, the rhythm of obedience that turned individuals into equations. And I realized that the Imperium does not conquer planets. It harvests purpose, strips the meaning from both victory and loss until only procedure remains. And I became good at following procedures, so good that the officers called me reliable. which is the closest this empire comes to affection. And when I closed my eyes between campaigns, I dreamed not of freedom, but of air thick with poison again, of storms that did not need reasons, of a sky honest enough to hate me without paperwork. And I woke gasping, because sometimes the memory of breathing wrong feels purer than the act of breathing right. They promoted me after a campaign that ended in statistics, numbers clean enough to make the blood forget its stickiness. And I wore the insignia like a confession pinned to cloth, because advancement in the Imperium is just another word for deeper servitude, and the new recruits looked at me the way I once looked at the sergeants, as if authority could save them from meaning. And I taught them what I had learned, that pain is currency, that silence spends better than speech, that mercy is best practiced by withholding it. And I saw in their eyes the slow flicker of realization that this, too, was a death world, only better lit, and that we were the ecosystem now. Predators by decree, prey by design. And the universe was a circle so perfect that even suffering admired its symmetry. Sometimes after battle, when the smoke cleared and the bodies cooled, I walked among the dead without recording their numbers, just watching how stillness transforms flesh into geography, how blood dries into a map of everywhere we've been. And I thought about my mother again, her voice caught between static and storm, telling me that mercy is waking and breathing. And I realized she was wrong and right in the same breath, because here mercy meant continuing to function in a system that called death proof of faith. And I wondered if she would recognize me now, if she would see the armor and the scars and think I had finally been accepted by the God she prayed to, or if she would know that the God had never noticed either of us, that all this iron and order was just another mask for silence in the rare moments between campaigns, when the engines idled and the officers allowed the lights to dim to something resembling night. I wrote her name in the condensation on the bulkhead, though I could no longer remember the exact shape of the letters, only the rhythm they made when whispered. And each time the moisture evaporated before dawn, as if the ship refused to carry memory. And the next day the drills resumed, and the chaplain reminded us that the Emperor's gaze is constant, that to doubt is to insult eternity. And I wanted to ask what eternity does with all the screams it collects, but my mouth had learned better uses, and so I kept my silence like a precious ration, something to be consumed only in private. I stopped counting worlds after 10 because they all ended the same way, with new names for the same ruins, with new prayers over the same bones. And I learned that victory in the Imperium means continuation, never conclusion, and that the only real difference between a death world and the rest of the galaxy is honesty, because my birth planet at least admitted it wanted us dead, while the rest pretended it was saving us. And the lie is always heavier than the truth when carried long enough, and sometimes I dream that the ground beneath the camps starts to tremble again, that the beasts below have found their way through the stars, that they crawl through the hull plates to remind us that survival is not the same as living. And I wake smiling because even that kind of death would mean home had not forgotten me. We were rotated into deeper campaigns after that, sent to cleanse worlds whose names blurred like smoke, jungles that whispered in tongues of decay, deserts that shimmered with heat so clean it burned thought itself. And through it all the prayer remained the same. By breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve. And I said it now not as worship but as record. Because history in this empire is written only by those who repeat the loudest, and I wanted the words to remember that I once existed, that a child once breathed ash and called it life, that a man once mistook obedience for purpose, that somewhere in the endless tally of the Emperor's silence, there is still a heartbeat that refuses to fall into rhythm, and when the transport finally lifted us again, engines rumbling like ancient judgment, I looked out through the viewing slit and saw the world shrinking to a pale scar against the dark. And I thought of the beasts below the stilts, of the poisoned air, of the trembling ground that spoke my name through the soles of my feet, and I whispered to the void, I remember, because memory is the only rebellion left to those who have been perfected by pain. And the stars did not answer, but the silence between them felt almost kind, like a mother's hand resting briefly on the mask of a child she knows she cannot save. and that was enough to keep breathing by the time I reached adolescence. The ground itself had learned to breathe beneath me, a slow pulse that throbbed through the rusted bones of the stilts and up into my feet like a whisper that didn't need words, only the reminder that we were never truly separate from what waited below. The elders said the tremors were nothing new, that the planet had always groaned in its sleep. But this felt different, closer, more deliberate, like a heart that had finally decided to wake. Each vibration hummed through the metal walkways, soft enough to be mistaken for wind at first, until the air filters began to rattle in unison, and the sound acquired shape and intent, as though something vast and patient were practicing speech just beneath the crust, rehearsing the syllables of our extinction. I would lie awake at night listening to it, counting the intervals, measuring the rhythm, and sometimes I could swear it was calling out names. Not just any names, ours. The elders forbade us from speaking about the tremors as if silence could rewrite geology, as if words were the true danger instead of what moved beneath us. They said the Earth's voice was sacred, and that to listen too closely was to invite blasphemy. But even they grew restless when the metal stilt started to sway during meals, soup trembling in its rusted bowls, engines coughing black smoke in protest. The old women began to mark their walls with circles of ash and blood, a superstition older than the Imperium's catechisms, protection not from spirits but from notice, because notice meant hunger, and hunger in this world always had teeth. I began to notice new crack spiderwebbing across the flooring of the lower habs, small fissures that widened each week until we had to seal those decks entirely. The air that leaked through them was hotter than breath and smelled of minerals and rot. The overseers told us to ignore it. They said the ground's moods were not our concern. But the ground, like any wounded animal, demanded attention. It started small, the deaths I mean. A miner or two vanishing down the cable lifts, their tethers found frayed or melted clean through. Then a whole crew gone. The cables themselves drawn taut and quivering as though something heavy below was pulling back. The elders blamed gas pockets or subsidence, or the will of the Emperor testing our devotion. We accepted every explanation because we had no alternatives to believe in. But explanations don't hold when the Earth starts to sound like it's breathing. One night I crept to the edge of the main gantry to see the hole they called the Maw, the wound left where Keras 11 had once stood. The mist rising from it pulsed faintly, red light flickering deep inside as if a heartbeat beneath the planet's skin. I dropped a bolt into the abyss. I expected an echo. I heard none, only a sigh, a soft exhalation that lifted the hair at the back of my neck and filled the air with the scent of burnt oil. I remember thinking that the planet was alive and lonely. The tremors grew into convulsions. The ground rolled in waves strong enough to rattle the upper decks, and the sound that came with them was not thunder, but something wetter, like the grinding of enormous bones. We gathered near the heat vents and prayed through our masks, repeating the catechism: by breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve. It didn't help. Hab Keras 10 disappeared first, swallowed in a single night. We saw its lights vanish one by one. Then the horizon glowed with a dull red flash as the generators went under. For hours afterward, the sky flickered with lightning that never struck, and the air was filled with a low, endless hum that settled into our bones like fever. When dawn came, there was only a crater steaming with metallic vapors, the edges slick and black as if the planet had cauterized its own wound. The elders declared the site forbidden. We obeyed, but curiosity festers faster than faith. I was 14 when I saw the ground open for the first time. We were clearing debris from a collapsed walkway when the metal beneath us began to thrum, not like a tremor but like a heartbeat felt through a wall. The others froze, and I remember pressing my palm flat to the surface just as the hum deepened and something inside the planet exhaled. The floor split. Heat rushed upward, a wave so fierce it peeled the paint from the rails, and from the fissure came a sound that was not a roar, but an intake of breath, the sound a predator makes when it tastes scent. We ran. The walkway collapsed behind us in sections, metal twisting like cloth. When I looked back, I saw tendrils, thick, black, wet things writhing through the smoke. They groped along the ruins as though blind but certain. By the time the tremor ended, a dozen workers were gone. Only a single glove, still smoking, remained where one man had stood. The elders burned it as an offering and called the death holy. I called it warning. We abandoned the lower decks after that, moving the habs higher up the stilts. The air was thinner, the wind sharper, but it was the only direction left to run. Yet the ground's reach grew longer. Thin roots, or what looked like them, started curling up the stilts during the nights, their surfaces slick with some translucent fluid that steamed in the cold air. The overseers ordered them burned. The fire took them easily, too easily, and when they died they screamed in a pitch so high it felt like pressure behind the eyes. The noise lasted for hours after the flames went out, echoing in the metal frames as if the stilts themselves remembered the agony. After that, none of us slept soundly. Some began to carve symbols into the walls, shapes we didn't recognize, older than the Aquila. A language of fear. The day the beast surfaced began without warning, as most endings do. The sky was still, the wind lazy, the air heavy with static. We thought it was calm. It was the inhale before the world exhaled. The vibration started deep, a low rumble that climbed through the stilts and into our teeth. Then the first sound came. The tearing shriek of steel under strain, the scream of a structure dying. The outer gantries buckled. The earth erupted. What emerged from beneath was not a creature as we understand creatures, but an event given shape. A tower of glistening chitin and wet muscle rising from the fog. Eyes that were not eyes gleaming with mechanical light. A mouth like a wound that breathed smoke. It moved like memory, fast and certain. A last fire erupted from the guards' towers. Streaks of red slicing the air, but the beams barely scarred it. The beast turned its head toward the light, and the air around it seemed to bend as though gravity had changed its mind. Then the tower holding the transmitter snapped like a twig. What happened next was less battle than collapse. The ground became liquid, flowing and buckling beneath us as more shapes rose from the fissures, smaller than the first, but no less grotesque. They tore through metal as if it were cloth. The noise was unbearable, a mixture of grinding steel, howling wind, and the chorus of human voices breaking into panic. I remember running without knowing where my feet landed, smoke and red haze swallowing the edges of everything. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with heat and the chemical tang of decay. I stumbled over a corpse, someone I had known once, and fell hard enough to taste blood through the mask. I almost stayed there, too tired to stand, but the tremor beneath me decided otherwise. The ground flexed like muscle, lifting me to my feet again. I ran because the world itself demanded it. By dawn, the beasts had retreated or sunk or dissolved. No one knew. The fog rolled back over the ruins, thick with the stench of burning oil and something organic. Half of Keris 9 was gone. The rest leaned drunkenly above the new craters. Stilts bowed and screaming in the wind. The survivors gathered near what remained of the central hub, their faces hidden behind cracked masks, their voices hoarse from filtered prayers. The overseers counted us mechanically, lips moving as though reading scripture, and when the tally ended, one of them said, "We rebuild." The words fell like stones. Rebuild what? Rebuild where? The ground had already made its choice. Yet we obeyed because obedience was older than hope. The days that followed blurred into monotony. We patched holes, welded beams, replaced filters that clogged as fast as they cleared. Every vibration from the earth set hearts racing. Every gust of wind brought the taste of corrosion. We learned to walk lightly, to speak in whispers, to move as though the air itself were listening. The beasts did not return, but their absence was worse than their presence. Waiting is its own form of torture. At night, the fog glowed faintly from below, shifting in slow currents that mimicked breath. I took to standing watch at the edge of the remaining gantry, staring down into that red mist, half expecting to see eyes open within it. Sometimes I thought I did. Weeks turned to months, though time had lost meaning. The tremors became part of life again, background noise to the clatter of tools and the hiss of steam. Fear dulled into habit. Yet deep inside me something changed. fear ceased to feel like fear. It became intuition, an extra sense that told me when the ground's heartbeat quickened or when the air thickened before a storm. It was almost comforting, like recognizing an old rhythm. The world's hatred had grown familiar, intimate. I began to think of it as home again, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. Everything else, faith, orders, hope, was someone else's lie. The ground never lied. It wanted us gone, and it was patient enough to wait until we agreed. Then came the night of the final collapse. I was on watch when the tremor began. Not the usual dull roll, but a deep, rapid vibration that made the air shudder in my lungs. The stilts groaned like tortured metal. The horizon glowed red, not from fire but from movement. The fog rose higher than I had ever seen, swallowing the lower decks in seconds. Through it I saw shapes, dozens, maybe hundreds, rising, twisting, crawling. The sound they made was not a roar. It was a chorus of breath, slow, synchronized inhalations that filled the night like an anthem. The ground opened, the air burned, and then the world ended again. I remember flashes more than events, the gantry collapsing under my feet, the shriek of tearing steel, the sight of people vanishing into fog without time to scream. I remember the taste of iron in my mouth as debris cut through my suit. I remember the heat of the air, so thick with energy it felt alive, pressing against my skin like another body. I remember standing at the very edge of the last platform, looking down into the glowing chasm, where the heart of the world beat naked and furious, and feeling no fear at all. Only recognition. This was not the enemy. This was the mother I had been born from, finally reaching up to take me back. I closed my eyes and whispered her name, not the Emperor's, not any word men had made, but the sound of air being stolen from lungs. The fog surged upward, and the platform fell away beneath me. When I woke, there was nothing left of Keras 9, only fragments of metal twisted into impossible shapes, half submerged in smoking mud. The fog had thinned, glowing faintly from within like the dying embers of a forge. I stood on a lone section of walkway jutting from the crater, the world silent except for the hiss of cooling steel. Every other soul was gone. The sky above had turned the color of ash. For the first time in my life, I removed my mask completely. The air was poison, but it was mine. It seared my throat, filled my chest, and I laughed until the laughter broke into coughing. I had survived again. And for the first time, survival felt like punishment. The beasts below were gone, but their lesson remained carved into my bones. Nothing that endures does so without becoming monstrous. The Imperium would come later, with its banners and engines, with its clean air and structured cruelty. They would call me a survivor. They would call my world dead. But even now, as I breathed the ash and stared into the crater pulsing like a dying heart, I understood the truth, that they never could. The beasts were never beneath us. They had always been inside us, waiting for the moment obedience and desperation met and called it faith. When they came from the sky, we thought the world was ending again. We prayed for death, and the Emperor answered instead with engines, a thunder that burned the clouds open and dropped light into our ruins. I had been alone for months, half-starved, half-feral, speaking only to the ghosts that the fog made for me. My skin had gone the color of old iron, and the air had shaped my lungs into machinery. When I first saw the fire trail of their descent, I fell to my knees thinking it was another storm, another punishment. But the sound had rhythm. No storm has rhythm. That was how I knew it was human. The dropships screamed as they tore through the atmosphere, their trails carving black veins across the red sky. And for a heartbeat, I believed salvation had a sound after all, loud, mechanical, confident. I was wrong, of course. It never saves. It collects. They landed on the bones of what was left of Keras 9, those armored men with their banners and sigils, their armor gleaming in the light that no longer belonged to our sun. I watched from the ridge, hidden beneath a blanket of rust-colored dust. Their ships hissed like beasts cooling down from anger, ramp doors lowering with ceremonial precision. The air shimmered with static and holy ozone, and their boots hit the soil in perfect time. No hesitation, no reverence, just occupation. The double-headed eagle on their flag shone white against the smoke. I remembered that mark from the rusted prayer plates in the habs, the one the elders said was salvation's promise. Seeing it now carved into armor, surrounded by guns, I realized it wasn't a promise at all. It was a brand. I crept closer through the fog, drawn by hunger and the distant scent of food. Real food, the kind that didn't taste of iron and despair. They were setting up their base, working with the same unthinking grace that the beasts below had once used to rise. Floodlights turned the ash into daylight. Towers unfolded from the ship's bellies, servitors scuttled like insects, and the air around them shimmered with something impossible. Purity. It hurt to breathe. I must have stumbled too close, because a beam of white light cut through the haze and pinned me in place. A voice barked something in High Gothic, then another in a language meant to sound kind. "Don't move," it said through a vox filter that stripped the warmth from the words. I raised my hands, though my body didn't know what surrender meant anymore. "Alive," I croaked, the sound more cough than voice. "Still alive." They surrounded me like a ceremony. 8 soldiers in black and gray, masks sealed, armor smooth as glass. One grabbed me by the arm with a servo-assisted gauntlet that whined when it tightened. He dragged me toward the lights as if I weighed nothing. The world had always been trying to pull me down. It felt strange to be pulled up for once. An officer met us halfway. A tall man with a face that looked freshly made, pale and sharp, untouched by air that kills. He removed his helmet, studied me with the curiosity of a scientist examining an insect. "You're from this world?" he asked. I nodded. The motion made my vision spin. "Keras 9, I said. He frowned, consulting a data slate offered by his aide. "That world was declared lost 5 years ago," the aide murmured. "No survivors." The officer's eyes lingered on me a moment longer before he said, "Apparently there's one." Then, almost kindly, "You must be resilient." Resilient. That was the word they used for those who hadn't died properly. They led me to their camp, where the air was clean enough to hurt, washed of every familiar taste until my lungs forgot what to do with it. They fed me water that had no flavor, food that dissolved without smell. My stomach rebelled at first, then accepted because hunger negotiates better than pride. The Medicae poked and prodded, muttering about toxins and cell degradation, about how my body shouldn't have survived a decade of poison. I wanted to tell them that surviving isn't something you choose. It's something that happens to you when dying takes too much effort. They wrote notes about me as if I were a mineral sample. One of them whispered that my lungs might be useful for research. I laughed through cracked lips. In the Imperium, being useful is just another way to die. More survivors came in the following days, ragged, wide-eyed remnants who had crawled out from the fog. The soldiers gathered us behind a chain-link fence near the edge of the encampment, pens of metal and light. They called it protection. We called it what it was, containment. Some wept with joy at being found. Others stared blankly at the sky that now glowed too bright. I sat apart, watching the soldiers move with clockwork precision, noting how they never removed their gloves, never looked anyone directly in the eyes. They weren't saviors. They were auditors. They weren't here to mourn what we'd lost, but to measure what was left to take. Each morning they came with their slates, scanning faces, counting bodies. The numbers mattered more than the names. When one of us collapsed, the guards dragged the body away without ceremony. Unfit for reclamation, they said. I never saw where they went. After a week, the administratum arrived, grey-robed scribes trailing servo skulls that recorded everything. They took our histories, our languages, our last fragments of identity, and filed them away under new numbers. When one asked my name, I gave it, proud of the sound for the first time in years. He frowned, shook his head, and wrote instead, Subject 47, Breath 9 Origin. My name was too long, he said, too inefficient. In that moment, I ceased to exist as a man and became an entry. An inventory item in the Emperor's empire. Then came the conscription. The officers assembled us one dawn beside the landing field, our breaths turning to mist in the manufactured cold. The officer with the perfect face read from a parchment lined with seals. "You have been chosen for Imperial service," he said, as if reading a blessing. Chosen. We had been chosen our whole lives, for pain, for labor, for survival. This was no different. He passed down the line with a stylus, handing each of us a page marked with the seal of the Astra Militarum. By signature, the bearer commits body and breath to the will of the Emperor. I asked what happened if I refused. The officer smiled. "Then you will return to the soil you love so much." His tone made it clear the soil wasn't optional. I signed. My blood left a perfect fingerprint on the page. They stripped us, burned our rags, shaved our hair. They gave us uniforms that smelled of antiseptic and hierarchy. We were herded onto the transports under floodlights so clean they erased the night. As the engines roared and the ship lifted, I looked through a viewport and saw my planet shrinking, a wound closing in on itself. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt betrayal. By the ground that had tried to kill me, by the air that had taught me to endure, by the silence that had raised me like a parent. The others whispered prayers as the clouds swallowed the world. I said nothing. The Emperor had never spoken to us. Why start now? The voyage off-world was a blur of cold corridors and endless hum. The soldiers never removed their armor. The servitors never stopped moving. We slept in rows like components waiting to be assembled. The ship's air was too thin, too clean. I longed for the grit of dust against my teeth. When the lights flickered to simulate dawn, an announcement came through the Vox. "Welcome to the Emperor's mercy." Mercy, like all Imperial words, had been stretched until it meant its opposite. We disembarked into another world, another camp. The sky was grey steel, the ground colder than truth. The sergeant who greeted us wore medals that gleamed like warnings. "Welcome to service," he said. "Welcome to purpose." Behind him, the banner of the double-headed eagle flapped in the wind. I realized then that the beasts of my world had not died. They had only changed uniforms. We learned quickly what service meant. Orders were gospel. Movement was breath. Thought was treason. They broke us down with methodical grace, waking us before dawn, drilling until our muscles bled, feeding us paste that tasted like the idea of food. We ran until our feet split, lifted until our spines sang. Every mistake earned correction by whip, every hesitation by isolation. The drill masters said pain was the Emperor's language, and we were learning to speak fluently. The first lesson was obedience. The second was silence. By the third, we no longer needed words at all. We became function, pure and efficient, stripped of everything that might slow the machinery of war. And through it all, the chaplains preached. "He does not love you," they said. "He uses you." The congregation answered in perfect rhythm. "By pain we serve. By death we are sanctified." I said it too. I had learned long ago that breathing out the right words keeps you alive longer than truth ever will. They told us we had been saved, that we had been elevated from the dirt to serve in the light of humanity's greatest empire. I knew better. Salvation is just another form of captivity, and light burns just as well as fire. When I lay in the barracks at night, staring at the ceiling lights that flickered like dying stars, I would close my eyes and imagine the tremor of the ground beneath me again. The hum of engines old and sick, the taste of ash so thick it made my gums ache. I would imagine my mother's cracked voice whispering through the rebreather, "By breath we endure." And for a moment I could almost smell the air of home, the air that killed, the air that was honest. When the next dawn came and the trumpets called us to march, I rose like every other soldier, armor cold against my skin, rifle heavy with meaning I no longer questioned. The sergeant shouted for us to fall in, his voice a hammer. We moved as one body, one breath, one machine. Behind the chanting, I heard something deeper, something old, the distant echo of the beasts below stirring again in the back of my mind. I wondered then if I had truly left my planet, or if I had only carried it inside me, the poison sealed under my ribs, the ground's hunger disguised as faith. Either way, the result was the same. The Emperor had his soldiers, and the world had its ghosts, and I, somewhere between them, kept breathing, always breathing. The first campaign they sent us to was not a war, it was a cleansing. That's what the officers called it, as if we were soap and the galaxy was a stain. The world below was lush, alive, and wrong in the way that beauty always is to soldiers of the Imperium. They said it harbored heretics, that its forests whispered treachery to the stars, that mercy there meant contagion. We descended in formation, a rain of steel falling on green, our transports carving scars into soil that had never known fire. When the doors opened, the air rushed in, warm, wet, thick with life, and it struck my lungs like betrayal. I coughed until the sergeant struck me across the mask and told me to breathe like a soldier, not an animal. The order steadied me and I obeyed. Obedience had always been the only language my body understood. We moved through the jungles in precise lines, rifles raised, purity seals fluttering from armor like tattered prayers. Every tree loomed like a cathedral spire, branches dripping with mist that sparkled as it fell. Somewhere in that silence I thought I heard my mother's voice again, whispering through the leaves. By breath we endure. But when I turned, there was only the rustle of foliage and the hiss of our rebreathers. The chaplain's voice crackled through the vox. Purify by flame, sanctify by pain. And we did. Villages vanished beneath the heat of Promethium. The sky turned black with the smoke of good intentions. The officers called it victory. I called it repetition. At night, when the guns slept and the air stank of carbon and regret, I sat apart from the others and cleaned my rifle, the same motion over and over, until my hands forgot they were attached to a man. The stars above were so bright they hurt to look at, and in their light, the ash of the world glowed faintly, settling like snow. A medic once told me that ash carries the memory of what it was. I wondered then if memory was the true poison, if every breath of soot was a whisper from what we had burned, asking to be remembered. I breathed deeply anyway. The Emperor requires faith, the sergeant said, but faith had burned away long ago. What was left was endurance. Endurance is cleaner than belief. It leaves no questions. Months passed like hours measured by pain and duty. We fought through cities, ruins, deserts, all the same, all necessary, all meaningless. The officers' speeches blurred into one long sermon about order, sacrifice, and the honor of serving in silence. I memorized every word, not because I believed them, but because belief wasn't required to repeat. Once, during a campaign that lasted 6 moons, a young recruit beside me hesitated before pulling the trigger. His hands shook. He said the enemy looked like his brother. I told him that hesitation is a luxury of people who still think they have a soul. He didn't flinch after that. The next day he was gone, taken by shrapnel, and his death report listed him as exemplary. In the Imperium, that's the only form of forgiveness we ever get. We were promoted, decorated, reassigned. The years bled together, a sequence of deployments and debriefings, of sermons and silences. I stopped marking the days. Instead, I counted the worlds that tasted of home, those whose air was thick enough to burn, whose soil hummed beneath the boots as though it remembered being alive. I never told anyone that I liked those worlds best. The clean ones were worse. The clean ones were where I could hear my thoughts, and thoughts have teeth. On the poisoned planets there was only instinct, only survival. The same old catechism of the flesh. By breath we endure. By pain we prove. By survival we serve. The words returned like a reflex each time the shooting stopped, each time I woke to the hum of Medicaid lights instead of the growl of storms. It was a lullaby written in ash. Once, years later, a new chaplain joined our regiment, fresh from terror, his robes white as bone, his voice pure and certain. He gathered us in the hold before a drop and spoke of salvation, of the Emperor's eternal gaze watching over his children, of how every breath we took was a gift from his divine will. I listened in silence until he asked us to pray. He said, "Repeat after me," and without thinking I whispered my mother's version. By breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve. The others followed his words, but mine echoed louder in my helmet. The chaplain heard and frowned. "That is not the approved litany," he said. "It's the only one that kept me alive," I answered. He didn't correct me again. Battle after battle, we survived what we shouldn't have. Luck, they called it. Blessing, maybe. I knew better. Death simply forgot my name. The air around me was always thicker, harder, heavier, as though the world itself refused to let me go. The Medici ran tests after each campaign, claiming I'd adapted to poisons that should have melted flesh. They said my lungs filtered toxins like machines. They said my blood burned hotter than regulation allows. They called me the Ashborn. I didn't argue. Names mean little when everything else is numbered. Still, the title felt right, an echo of a world that refused to die inside me. Then came the campaign that ended us. A world far from any star I knew. Dark skies painted with electric storms. The ground cracked open in patterns too regular to be natural. They said it was tainted, touched by the warp. A place where the laws of faith bent and screamed. The mission was simple: purge and reclaim. No one ever returned from reclamation. We landed under violet lightning, the air vibrating with whispers you could feel on your skin. Every step sent tremors through the dust, and in the distance I saw towers made of bone, or metal shaped like it, rising from the earth like the teeth of something buried. The sergeant's voice trembled for the first time when he gave the order to advance. The ground answered him. It began with the same hum I'd heard on Keris 9, the same slow heartbeat beneath the soil, patient and certain. The world moved under us, breathing, waking. The earth split, and from it came the same light, that terrible red glow that turns men into silhouettes. The others fired wildly into the pit, their beams swallowed by smoke. I stood frozen, knowing what was coming before it rose. The beasts had followed. No, not followed, remembered. They had waited for me, the last child of their world, the one who carried their poison in his lungs. They came like the past made flesh, like memory given hunger. The ground tore itself open, and the battlefield became a grave that refused to stay closed. I raised my rifle, but my hands didn't move to shoot. I knelt instead, breathing in the ash that wasn't ash but recognition. The air burned, the world screamed, and men died screaming with it, but I felt only calm. I understood then that the beasts had never been monsters. They were survival given form. They were what the Imperium made of every world it tried to purify, the answer to its own cruelty. The cycle had come home. I laughed as the sky split apart and fire poured down like rain. I laughed because the sound of my own breathing drowned out the screams, steady and relentless. The sergeant shouted something over the vox, but his words melted in the static. I closed my eyes and inhaled one last time. The air tasted exactly as it had the day I was born. Hot, metallic, alive. When I woke, there was nothing left, just silence and a sky full of dust. The beasts were gone. The army was gone. The world was still. I stood in the ruins of another purification and realized that I was finally what the Imperium wanted me to be. Empty, obedient, unkillable. I had outlasted the gods and the monsters both. The wind moved through my armor with a sigh that sounded almost like a prayer. I looked up and saw the faint outline of ships leaving orbit, abandoning what they couldn't claim. They called this world cleansed. They were wrong. It was waiting. Just as Keris 9 had waited, just as I always had, I took off my helmet and breathed deep. The air was poison again, but it was honest. My lungs, bred on death, drank it in without protest. I smiled. Somewhere beneath me, the ground trembled once, faint and familiar. The rhythm of it matched my pulse perfectly. For the first time, I understood what my mother meant when she whispered through the static of her dying mask. We were never meant to be saved. We were meant to survive long enough to remember what saving costs. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a life measured only by endurance, I let myself exhale without fear. By breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve, and beneath the ash the world breathed with me.